And we are back and ready to assemble and solder the components that we showed you installed on the previous video. So I have all the components in place. Now I'm about to solder each of the individual components, starting with the LEDs and then moving with the resistors, transistors, capacitors, and the LEDs. And on another video, we'll demonstrate how we do the final soldering of the switch and the power supply terminal snap. And so here I am, and you have seen me doing soldering already. I placed the solder tip on one side, the solder on the other side, met with the solder, count 1, 2, 3. I try to be careful not to create any bridges on these components because that will not be acceptable. The eyelets or the terminals where these terminals are soldered are very tiny, so I cannot zoom in, but you can imagine I have just a small air gap in between components or LED terminals, and I have to do it right. So let's check it out. That being done, we should have a conical shiny termination joint. The components are in place, the LEDs, first two LEDs. Then we're going to proceed on to solder the capacitors or the resistors. We'll see which one is easy to do here. I'm going to basically repeat the process of creating solder joints per connection with solder, right? And so I make sure the terminations of the component are totally bent so that the component is in place. I'm going to be soldering here the capacitors. Notice that I stay for only 2 or 3 seconds on the joint between the board, the eyelet, and the terminal of the component I'm soldering. And once again, the separation is very tiny. So if I stay too long, I'm going to probably create bridges, which you don't want. So I just soldered the 2 capacitors. You kind of align these as you go forward. So they're all soldered and ready to go. I'm going to do the resistors now. 2 of the 4 resistors. We got a 330 ohms resistor, and we got a 10K or 10,000 kilo ohm resistor. We're going to do the upper resistors, and these are again through hole components. The operation is exactly the same I've done before. I heat the joint, I bring the solder, melt the solder, form the conical shape. We throw the tip and move on to the next one. You have to do this real quick, otherwise dwelling too long, it'll leave too much solder and possibly create bridges, which we don't want. So these were the resistors that I just soldered. We're moving forward with the next part and checking out the resistors. Seem to be great. I'm going to do the transistors as the next part. Transistors are 3-legged components. We discussed transistors before. You have at the center the base, and one side you have the collector, and the other side you have the emitter. So let's go ahead and solder those. So soldering the transistors, and with this you have to be a little more careful, just because there's just a little tiny air gap in between the LEDs of the transistor. So deposit, solder, withdraw, do it quick, do it fast, otherwise you're going to create joints and bridges, and that will not be a good thing for a circuit like this. So let's check out the transistors. They're soldered, they're in place, and they're well done. So hopefully I don't have to redo any of these solder joints. I prefer that if I have to rework and refill solder, I could do that later, but that's better in comparison to having to remove bridges that you create. So a care that must be always take into account is that we don't want to bridge any components where they don't need to be bridged. Now there'll be some instances where bridges are allowed per design, but in our case everything has to be done properly. So we got the components. I'm going to go ahead and solder the the other resistors. I think that's what's remaining. We got a couple of resistors and we got a couple of LEDs. So I'm gonna go ahead and probably do them at once. So there are the LEDs on the lower portion, but I have a couple of resistors I haven't done, so I'm gonna just do that. Those resistors need to be soldered. So I'm just doing that. Notice how quickly I move in and out. Count 1, 2, probably 3 seconds, and then out. I'm gonna do the last two LEDs, light emitting diodes, for this non-mobile LED blinking robot. All right, you're seeing how things are done, and this is all matter of practice, right? So if you practice, then you'll become good at this. Like anything else, you need to practice. So this is pretty much it, all the components. I think that the only remaining part that we have will be the terminal for the power supply, which we're going to do another video because this is getting pretty big. And so, but this goes on this part. I'm going to put it in place so that when I come back, we'll do the other part. So we'll see you in a little bit with the other part. Thank you.